if you speak to someone who said they once had a premonition, how do you think about that? And because you can't validate it, but they're telling you they've had a premonition before, and they were driving, and then they kind of just took a break, dozed off, and then they had a vision of like something that would happen up the road, and it did happen.
Um, Usually I would just say, you just ask them what they were thinking of. Usually it's like just an accurate prediction. It doesn't seem that weird that you could predict what people have a premonition about sometimes. I mean, people say it about weird things, but there's usually something perfectly sensible. Or, I mean, there's a concept that Carl Jung used to describe that, like a chance encounter that doesn't seem to be described by anything other than this like almost mystical connection.
Yeah.
Like when you see a coincidence, like, oh, you think about something and then you see a picture of it, and there's no reason it would have ever shown up. Like you're afraid of birds and you're talking to somebody about birds, and then a bird shows up out of nowhere. Like you say, there's this, I forget what concept he used, and he described it
Synchronicity.
like there's, yeah, synchronicity. That's what it is. I mean, I think people would often think in terms like that, but I think things are connected enough that things can just happen by chance. And I think usually that if people talk about things like that, like coincidences, I just think of, well, yeah, things can that like that can happen. Doesn't mean your explanation's correct. It's just there was something that's interesting, but there could be many reasons why there's things seem to line up sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, I'm looking at it from the perspective of this epistemology. So, like, obviously, given my own life experiences, I've never had a premonition. So I'm like,
Yeah.
well, I've never had one, therefore you haven't had one. Is that or there's more that I know there's more there, because you're looking at like how you've noticed reality works, and like our consciousness doesn't affect reality and so on. But
Yeah.
then, so do you then assume, if someone says that to you, just assume, oh, it was a coincidence? Is that what
It gets tricky
it's
because
tricky. Yeah, it is
you need
tricky.
to know what it is they were looking at. Or you just think it approach in terms of evidence. You think you just ask first, what would you need to see? Like you, or what evidence would you need to understand what they're talking about? Like you gather evidence about, say, what they were doing at the time, or, well, where they were, or even what it was they had a premonition about. I mean, you could say you have a premonition about, like, oh, you saw the tree about to fall before it did. Usually that just means like you predicted it would. It's not that you foresaw the future, but like little things like that aren't that weird.
Yeah, I don't think so either. Although
But
I
then it
guess
might, go
it
ahead.
isn't. I agree, it's not. But it's only weird in a conversation if someone then says it was a premonition of the future and they believe in them. Then
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, you need to ask like their evidence, like what made you think that it's actually awareness of the future rather than just a prediction? Or what's the distinction between a prediction and a premonition?
yeah.
You just really have to deal with the evidence, or what reason would you have to think that it really was a premonition? What would be necessary for it to be one?
What's interesting is, I guess I'm looking at this mainly from the angle of how do I make a conversation like that productive and interesting? And then there's always like, I do
Yeah.
think you can, I mean, you get to choose who you want to speak with and how much time you want to spend speaking with them, obviously. Like, and you don't always want to invest your time and a lot of time in specific people. But, I was thinking like the questions you asked, maybe you could learn more about them, or like, or learn, yeah, exactly what makes them think it's a premonition. So That's an interesting question. Or what about this? Actually, this question of like, what would convince you that it wasn't a premonition?
That's a good
Just
question to ask them too, because then they'll have to be thinking of evidence. Like, what would they see that would change their mind?
right.
I mean, you could. Uh, I think even people like that, they still want to have some kind of evidence for their beliefs. It's not usually completely arbitrary. That they do have some
I
standard,
don't think so. Yeah.
and so you can
Um,
ask them like, well, what if it were something else? It's kind of your creativity too, like offering these other possibilities, because you're just at looking, think of what kind of evidence would somebody need to change their mind, because
yeah,
that's how you
yeah,
should actually change your mind.
yeah. I've always when I've had people say that to me, like they've seen a ghost, I've always thought they're lying. So I don't know because it's such a strange because I've never experienced it or seeing a ghost. And
I would say when
I obviously don't believe in ghosts or any of that. So
yeah, I know
I,
when I was younger, I was always interested in paranormal things. I
yeah,
don't know if I really believed, but like that unknown was always interesting.
mm,
Like unusual circumstances, how would you know what really happened? And that
yeah,
always interested me, whether it's like aliens or how did the Egyptians build the Great Pyramids or what's the Loch Ness monster? Like how would you investigate those things if you wanted to know about them? And how would you find the right answers rather than just simply making something up? I mean, those sort of questions have always interested me. So on some level, I think I've always been able to find interest in these wild stories. I think there's often some element of truth that you can find within it.
yeah.
That's something they were observing. It was like mistaken identity and things like that. And it can bring you somewhere new to think about.
Do you think that sometimes the if the event did happen, the interpretation is motivated by like some similar motivation to the one you might have if you believe in like some passive god? Like there's some similarity there. Like there's a
I think so.
more than just yeah, okay. That's interesting.
Like they see something and they explain it with their standards of evidence that they know, which you might say these are bad standards of evidence or these are bad standards to make these conclusions. But I think it's people take it as some kind of evidence and they just interpret it, which anyone has to. I mean, if you see a light in the sky and it crashes onto the earth, I mean, we know it'd be probably just a meteorite now. But if you think 5,000 years ago, how would you begin to answer what it is
Yeah, you're
that you
right.
saw?
That's well, we explain the clouds as like thunder gods, right? Or like lightning as like the
Yeah,
god of thunder. So yeah, that's true. Hmm. Okay. Cool. Something for me to think about as I make my conversations more productive.
I
Okay.
think a lot of times these people make paranormal claims. It usually is trying to get at something that is hard to understand or even that nobody understands yet.
Like
Like
what?
I find it interesting to hear about like hallucinatory experiences
Yeah.
that people say are like revelations with God
Yeah.
because those things do happen. It's interesting to investigate what it is they're experiencing that makes them believe it's God as opposed to a hallucination. Things like that I find very interesting. Not just like in the way that you're trying to investigate what's their way of thinking, what are their experiences like, what kind of mental states are there, and need to gather evidence on different ways of feeling.
Yeah. I tend to think with I think for me hallucinations would be like induced hallucinations would be in a different category because that's testable. You can those plants have psychoactive substances that make you see and feel different,
Yeah,
like completely different things. And I agree with you. It's definitely an interesting field, especially in psychology. But to me, it is different than someone claiming they saw a ghost, for example, or they,
yeah, it is.
had a vision of the future and the thing happened.
Yeah, I mean the difference
It's
would be
similar, but
like,
it's
yeah,
yeah,
because ghosts are things you see out in the world.
Yes.
They're outside of you, but hallucinations are within yourself. So they're
Yeah.
different that way.
Yeah. And I guess people can, if you want to speculate, people can bring whatever they already somewhat believe into a hallucinatory experience. So, if you believe there's some passive God, and I think some people do, a lot, maybe I'm going to guess a lot of people do, I don't really know, but then it makes sense that you might assume you spoke to God.
Yes.
Okay. We're talking about there's principles, and I think the objectivist principles are absolute, like justice is absolute, right? Independence is absolute. That's how I understood it.
Um, I don't like the word absolute, because that brings too many connotations of like contextless absolute. But I'm thinking of it more like, by nature of living as man, these things always apply. When the context of being human is where they apply, and as long as you're human, they apply.
Okay, got it. Got it.
I know that's almost like more explanation than necessary, but that's really just emphasizing the way it's contextual. Is based on this nature of man that you discover. Like if you were operating by some other nature, or something made you no longer man, or whatever it might be, those things really wouldn't apply anymore. You'd have to come
Yeah,
up with something else.
yeah. Which might, with transhumanism, I don't, or we still have a rational faculty, but who knows? That'll be
Yeah.
what kind of modifications we make with that, what that impact that then has on philosophy. But,
Yeah.
um, because like you can have. I'm just wondering how principles fit in with other fields. So, like, you can have contextual business skills. Like, I spoke to a friend yesterday and he gave me an example. Like, he always tries to make sure that customers get replied to as soon as possible. That's one of his principles. If you want to call it that, I don't know. And like, there's tons of others he could run off, like a whole list of principles or rules. I don't know what to call them, but how does that relate to philosophical principles?
Those sound like heuristics to me. They're more like rules of thumb rather than like principles. Like I guess there's a minor difference between the two. Heuristic is more pragmatic usually. You use it when it works, otherwise it doesn't matter. It's not like you need to follow it that closely. But a principle seems to be more like a foundation of your thinking. It seems to hold more water, holds more weight. I think a principle is um, just a proposition that's applies to many contexts. That's foundational.
Okay. But then, so there wouldn't be, so there would still be principles in, like, in his case for business, but they would be the ones that apply to most contexts.
Yeah, that's the way the principle seems to be used within like different fields. Like principles of design, like you would think about what are the fundamentals, like shape and color are things that are
Right.
fundamental to design. You say,
Right.
what are the principles of color? Like they've gotta be complementary, for example.
Yeah.
Those are kind of like abstractions because it applies to almost everything within design. Like there's always a consideration of color as long as you're talking about design. Otherwise, it's not design you're thinking about because those things are fundamental and foundational to everything else within design.
Got it. That makes sense. Do you know, have you heard of Niccolo, I think Machiavelli's The Prince?
Yeah, I've read it before.
Oh, you've read it? I haven't read it,
Yeah.
but a friend just told me about it recently. And I was wondering, like, so it seems like it's a book about, I'm just going to bring it up. It's like a book about how to run a kingdom or something.
Yes.
Yeah. And,
Principles of ruling a kingdom, I guess you could say.
and it made me think about, like, obviously in objectivism, the principles are that you can't survive by force. And yet here there is someone making principles for ruling people by force. And it just makes me wonder, like, how does does that mean they're all useless? Because that doesn't make sense. Like
It's
if force, you know what I'm saying? Like this, it's so weird that you can have, you can say at the same time, okay, force is not a way to survive, and yet you can have someone develop principles. And yeah, maybe, I mean, do they not add anything like these principles?
well, in terms of
That's where I'm confused.
Machiavelli, I think it more in terms of not. It's hard to tell what he's prescribing versus describing. Like he's giving a broad catalog of
Right.
different rulers and different ways they can operate and which ways they gain power just by observing what you see in Italy during the Renaissance, like who has
Mm,
power, who retains it, and whether or not you think it's right or wrong. He's saying this is what they do, and we could argue like, well, there might be principles of politics in terms of what are the ways people gain power, and we could just talk about those fundamentals. But then we can discuss whether the morality of those certain actions. We can think about like, well, there's people can rule by fear, people can rule through love of their people. Like you could do either, and he doesn't really tell you which is the best way, just that these are ways to do it, and certain leaders have done it better than others. He's a bit
you
pragmatic about it because he's just saying this is what people do.
when you're saying he, you know, he looked at Renaissance Italy, are you then saying so he's generalized from the particular, but it's not necessarily true
Yes.
as as a principle, like it won't necessarily work? Is that what you mean?
Well, we can look at it two ways. Like one, Machiavelli's coming to these conclusions, and we could say he's making some mistake in that, or he disagrees with objectivism that reason is our means of survival. But either way, he still observed these things. He's probably the first person to really do political science and really
Right.
analyze it in a scientific way almost.
Yeah.
He's making evidence of what he saw, described what he saw, and said, well, if you want to rule, if you want to have power, this is what you do.
Right. Because it made me think of like, you know, there's all this, I still need to get deeper into the principles and virtues section, but it made me think of like, because they brought up like an example of a thief a couple of times, or like a swindler, and like, would there not be any principles for like thieves or swindlers? It seems weird to, your principle is basically a generalization. Like, would they
Yeah, I
not
mean,
have, you know, like principles that would then help them perform the thieving at a higher level?
yeah, I think you could say there's principles of thievery. I mean, whether or not it's moral to do so is like a separate question. I mean, you can have the principles of something regardless of if it's right or wrong. It's just, you could say the principles of, well, what makes a good thief? It's, I don't know, being sneaky, I don't know, whatever, or good at lying, which we could argue that therefore, like, well, you shouldn't want to be a good thief. Nobody should be a good thief because there's no such thing as a good thief.
Right.
Like, it's not good for your life to be a thief. But insofar as people are thieves, and so,
And some are better than others.
yes, I mean, we can observe that easily. Some are better than others. And we can make other generalizations from there about, like, well, what kind of success do these different professions give you? I mean, you can talk about all the principles of thievery, or all the principles of being a writer, or the principles of being a botanist, and we could analyze them differently like that. Like, given the principles of to operate like these people, a thief doesn't seem to be coincide with the good life. What makes a good
Yeah.
thief coincide with a good life?
I guess I'm just trying to work out the relationship between these different sets of principles. So you can have principles that long term do not help you, but short term do. And then you can also have principles that help over the entire term. Like that would be philosophical principles. Like I'm just confused how you can
Yeah, I
have,
mean,
you know what I'm saying? You know, sort of what I'm getting at? Like when I read Opa, I'm like, oh, okay, you can't have any other principles according to this. But then, I'm thinking, well, I mean, there's the prince and there's all these other people who come up with principles for just random things, and they help in some way.
I would just consider there's different types of principles. You could say there's philosophical principles, moral principles,
Right.
because moral principles are trying to find out what are the principles to make you a good moral person. I mean, I could talk about the principles of being a thief and what can make you a good thief, but they contradict moral principles or that they go against moral principles.
Right.
So you can analyze them, like what are the foundational beliefs of this way of being, of this way of acting. You don't even need to use the word principle, just say, what are the foundational beliefs? What are the foundational facts that give rise to understanding what makes a good thief or a good murderer or something like that, as opposed to the facts that give rise to a good businessman or something like that.
I was thinking, I don't know, because maybe I don't have enough context, so this thought is kind of detached. But I was wondering as I was reading through part of the virtue chapter, like, okay, let's say I was a king in like, you know, 1430 or something like that. And I ruled by force and I thieved from all my subjects. If I had picked up opal, I would be like, oh, well, I have to give it up. I can't rule by force. And then I'd probably just get killed by some other guy. So I'm just trying to understand how, like it seems like if you live in a society of force, then force would have to be I'm just trying to fit that all together because I'm puzzled by it. Like it's telling you like force isn't the way to survive. And yet I was thinking like, doesn't it depend on the context? Like if I'm in a kingdom, I can't just turn it into I don't know if that question makes sense because I'm just pulling
I
random
think
thoughts.
there's some truth to that. Like, if you live in a world of force, it's almost made impossible to live by your nature. In a way, that's what Rand thinks is so bad about a dictatorship, because you can't even operate by your normal mode of operation. Right. That you can't even succeed at living life by nature. Like no matter what you do, you're screwed, and it's just whoever has the most force wins, and nobody's allowed to think anymore. At some point, you would just have to make society stable again. I think you're right. If the entire world was all force all the time, and everybody operated by that way of thinking, it might be like a dictatorship that it would be very difficult to change the situation. It's like you have to rebuild civilization practically.
Well, the other thing this links to is that question of mine where like at what point is something this? Because like we all know that there's no like utopia without any force in the world. And there wasn't ever. And so it's like, I guess to what extent and like how much force do you need before it's literally impossible to survive? I guess some of that is in We the Living, right? But
yeah, I think on some level that's why it takes so long to build civilization. You can't just overnight say like force is banned, that's it, nobody's doing any force ever again. Like you need to gradually build it up, that the connections between people, the mechanisms within society, like businesses or trading, that eventually it becomes easier and easier to live by your nature because everybody's trying to cooperate, and it enhances your productivity and all that. In a way, that's what Rand argues about capitalism, that it allows us to live in a non-forced way. It's the best way to live by our nature. Not only that, it can enhance what we can attain alone. It can enhance our abilities when we exchange in that kind of way.
So if you live in a society with some level of force, to that extent, there's no principle, there's no guide. That like anxiety or partial anxiety would be your natural state if you have, like, if we're talking, like, if we're saying that you can't have principles for using force effectively, or you can't have principles for like dealing in, living under a dictatorship, then the point is you just like, that's what it is. There's no escape from it. You're going to feel anxiety. Is that sort of the,
kind of.
yeah,
I mean, whether it's anxiety or whatever it is,
whatever
you
it is.
just
Yeah, I don't
couldn't
know.
live very well. I mean, then that's where it gets into politics. Like, that's where you ban the use of force and why you have the state control it, the use of force at all, and why. Like, because that's the way to make force in control without dominating our lives, and allows the people who don't use force to successfully live their lives, and you can just keep building up from there. Like, you're
Let,
right that force won't ever go away, but we can have a control on it.
let's go back to that example. Let's say you're in 16, or if you're Louis, you're a shogun in 1585 in Osaka province,
Yeah.
and like you have the knowledge that you have now, and you can't just completely remove your reins, because then some other shogun will come and kill you. So what do you, in that situation, like, does that mean there's no principles to guide you? There's no thinking you can apply that will help you make your little fief better than other fiefs? Or yeah.
I mean, I would think I would try to say unify Japan would be like an ultimate goal. Like, I wouldn't be just trying to, because I think unifying Japan would be a way to eliminate this constant fear of force, this constant threat of force and destruction. I would think that'd be like a better goal for it. And I would agree that I can't just let go of the reins, because even somebody else worse than anything could take over instead and do much worse harm than anything. At some
But
level, you
then
do need to acknowledge the reality of it, and you can't go immediately. You have to gradually get there.
But at this point, are you even being guided by principles, or is this just pragmatism? Like, is there actually, what I'm confused by is, like, we say there's pragmatism and then there's principled thinking. But in this
Yes.
case, in this situation where we're living in a society like this, do principles help you or not? Like,
Yeah, it's
yeah,
hard.
are there principles, and two, do they help you? And then it just seems, the conflict for me, or the contradiction, is like, I mean, I do notice when you look back at history, some rulers are better than others. So the question is that just pure chance and, uh, you know, chance, it doesn't matter, they're all pragmatist, or were there specific things they did that did, uh,
Well, when you say one's better than another, what do you mean they're better?
maybe I don't know, like under one person, a kingdom flourished more. Um, the farmers did better, or something like that, and then under other kingdoms they didn't. And so you wonder, like, were there principles there, and or is that just all chance, because there's no principles in a
Yeah,
context like that? That's what
you're right.
I'm.
I mean, if it were chance, it didn't matter the leader. It's just the luck of the draw. That was a nice guy at a nice time. Or it could have been a nice time with the bad guy. And I guess you could see it that way. Like, how do you know it had to be the good guy that made it that way? Was the flourishing caused by the good leader, or has it nothing to do with that? And I would tend to think I would look towards,
It's not even a good leader. You could think of it as, like, it is a thief. Like, if we put it in these extreme terms, like, it's just
yeah,
a very powerful thief, right? Who's telling
yeah,
people what to do. So is it a good thief or not? Then that question is that.
yeah. I think principles become like a matter of what do you want it to be in the long term. Like, it's not like you're just trying to inch your way by, not lose what you have, and doing whatever it is that maintains that. It's trying to make it long range. Thinking in like pragmatism is more short range. You're just looking at how do you maintain what you have, and it's not about looking towards what sort of kingdom do I want. Do I want to benefit one? Do I want to create one where everybody's flourishing? And not only that, it will further the way I live my life as a leader and further my subjects. And, or even it's like maybe I won't even have subjects. I'll let them be free people, or things like that. Or you just come to realize that you might come to realize that power isn't what you're seeking. because that's not what makes you a good leader. Even if you're trying to figure out if the leader caused something good, I mean, you would still strive to be like, you want to make the conditions where that flourishing is possible. Because I don't think you really could argue that flourishing just happens. It's some interaction among people. So if you're a leader of some kingdom, something you're doing is going to have impact. You could just think, do my actions make it worse? Do they make it better? Do they do nothing?
But let's go back to that example you gave, like you'd unite Japan if you were, but then you'd unite Japan by force, right? So is that a principle or is that pragmatism?
It's hard to say because force in that context might say those who initiate its use. It's hard to distinguish that in war, like who initiated force.
Got it. Okay.
But you could say there's these shoguns running around, going into villages without much provocation, killing everyone, or raping all the women and stealing all the food.
Yeah, the
and you could
context
say
is...
that's like, you could fight them off with, legitimately fight them off and kill them. It's not the use of force that's wrong, it's the initiation. So you could unite based on like these principles of justice you have, that you can make people recognize that these principles help you live your life better. Not only do they help you, but they make for a better city, a better town.
Do you think that all instances of generalizing the particular are principles?
Principle, I just think it's just like an honorific. It's just
What's
extra
honorific?
good. It's just
Honor.
extra good.
Honorific.
Like it's extra important.
Okay. Extra important. But it is a case of generalizing the particular, right? Like you're looking at a lot of instances and then you're forming some.
It's some kind of generalization and abstraction.
Okay. And then
you've got to make it, it's like boiling it down, like taking away all these excess details that don't quite matter and all you have left are the key details. Whether it's like I said about principle design, like color would be a key principle, a key feature that you need to think about, that you abstract away all the other details.
So it's just a generalization, which we do when we form a concept. And I guess what I'm curious then about is like how you can have a generalization or a principle that conflicts with some wider one, and how that works. Like take, for example, I know that because I finished reading Musashi, and I know that he also wrote a book on his principles for like battle, and there's the Art of War, which has principles for war. How does that fit into, like there's all these principles for war and using force and all that. So we're using our minds, and you can't it doesn't make sense to say, oh, none of that helps because it's not, you can't win by force. Like clearly the thought being put into force, like the Roman Empire putting it into like arrangement of soldiers and all that, was helpful. But I'm just trying to figure out in my mind how that works, how you can have like a principle that helps you use something that is supposed to be against using principles. Like you have a principle to use force, which is against, initiation of force. I'm just kind of confused by that whole, we can have principles that help us use force, and yet also we know that using force is bad as a principle. I'm like untangling that in my mind. It's not, you know what I'm saying?
There's probably a more precise way to say it. Like, I get what you're saying, and so I think there's an imprecision in the way I said it. Like, you do want your principles to be integrated. You don't want them to go against each other. So in a way, you could say them like anti-principles in a way. Like, I mean, yeah, some thieves are better than others, but you can say it violates your principles of morality, that it violates something else, that you can't really have a good thief. It's just a thief who steals more or something like that. Like, it depends on the word good. Like
Yeah,
you could
it's
have
tricky.
principles of it, as in the foundations that make you a thief. But I mean, I would like the word anti-principle, because like it is a principle, or like a miss or disintegration. Like they're integrations, but they're wrong. So in a way, you could say they're like principles of thievery, or like misintegrations.
And yet, but you couldn't say that about like principles of war though, right? Because it would be then, if that was true, then you'd say they don't help at all. But I'm not sure that's true, that they don't help at all.
I mean, you
Like,
could say insofar as the principles of war are, insofar as they're justified wars,
yeah,
that you're in the justified party, then yeah, sure, do everything it says.
yeah,
Or you could, from your own learning, you could recontextualize principles. You could refit them given what you learned. Like you could have all these principles of war, and then over time you could discover, well, what are the moral principles that justify going to war? And that could modify what you've discovered about the art of war. I mean, that was written thousands of years ago. So
yeah.
wouldn't it be weird to say, oh, Sun Tzu was wrong about some stuff? I mean, that wouldn't be that weird to say.
Well, was he wrong? Maybe he might be wrong in this context, but was he wrong in that context? I don't know. Maybe he was wrong in that context too. I guess it's all like, those are contextual, like you said, in objectivism, the principles are, that's what's weird. And I'm still not clear about, but like in objectivism, the principles for morality are contextual, or depend on the context of us being human and having a rational faculty, for example.
Yeah.
But outside of that, if suddenly we change our faculty somehow, then those principles don't apply anymore.
If it somehow happened, but and there's no reason to think it has or would anytime soon. But sure, like imagine like, I don't know, an alien species that didn't have brains, but they had some other way of thinking. We're not even thinking, like just functioning.
Yes.
They might not need morality. It's just an incoherent question. Like imagine a morality for plants, but imagine there were like plants that could space travel, like whatever weird imagination idea you could have. They're not thinking, they don't have brains, they don't have anatomies, they don't have neurology or uh, neurons in their bodies. So thinking wouldn't even apply, cognition wouldn't apply. It just doesn't make sense anymore.
Well, cognition does, but thinking maybe not. Like cognition in the sense of perceiving something. But
Sure.
anyway, the point is like, the reason I brought that up was like, yeah, it's still strange in my mind that you can have like, so principles are you can have a principle that's only applicable within some very small context, like 1400 in China, which is just strange. Like, okay, you're going to write a whole book about war and it doesn't work, but it works in China in 1400.
Yeah, I mean, the good thing about Sun Tzu and also Machiavelli is they're trying to abstract into the future. They're not trying to be narrow. They really are trying to broaden it to any war, any political system in the future. They're trying to make it abstract, and we can tell they're not being too concrete bound. Machiavelli, I think, kind of an Aristotelian way of analysis,
Right.
like categorizing things and making its categories and then analyzing.
Yeah. But let's see, I've got the book here with me. I wanted to ask you a question about something else. It's here. I can read it out to you. Actually, I've got it here as well. And so this Nassim Taleb said, "The fool generalizes the particular. The nerd particularizes the general. Some do both, and the wise does neither." So he's making a case for pragmatism, isn't he? Is that, or what?
Can you repeat it, the quote?
Yeah, I've got the page number here, so I'll just show you. I'll put it in front of the screen so it'll be easier, so you can just read it.
Sure.
72. Let's see if that, can you see that? Does that, it's probably all upside down.
Yeah,
Hey?
I got it.
Yeah.
Full generalizes.
The nerd particularizes the general. I'll type it in. I'll type it in the chat.
So weird. I'm thinking about that. Full particularizes.
Nerd particularizes general. Some do both. And the wise does neither. Just sent it to you. So I think he's talking about the full forming principles and using induction, and then the nerd is the one who does. He's very deductive.
I think you're right about the nerd being over analytical about things that people like, being too detailed. In a way, the fool sounds like somebody who like over generalizes is something that doesn't make sense. That like you see
Right.
one bird that flies, therefore all birds must fly, which is kind of foolish. Like you have some evidence that birds fly, but you can't just blithely say like, I saw a bird fly, therefore every single bird that ever existed and will ever exist flies. Like it's almost like arbitrary. Like it's foolish. And it almost sounds like he's saying that the wise person isn't trying to overgeneralize or find that nitpick details. They just understand things as they are. Which, I mean, of course, it's a bit poetic and not, I don't think it should be taken literally, but it seems like trying to get the middle ground between this extreme rationalism and extreme empiricism. Which, you're right, it's a little pragmatic, but I like the sound of it.
What does it mean to be pragmatic? Does that mean like, because we talked before, how can you be fully pragmatic? Like, what does that even mean? What does that look like? Does that just mean every moment you just decide purely based off an unreasoned feeling? Or because if we can't help from generalizing, and we generalize, and principles are generalizations anyway, then how are we ever fully whatever it is, what was the word? How can we be fully pragmatist?
Well, let's just think of it in terms of pragmatist in the negative sense. Like pragmatic is sensible in the sense that like it must apply to reality in a way that, yeah, we want to be pragmatic in that way. Things have to apply to reality. It must be usable. It must have some function for your life. If it has no real purpose, then you barely can call it valid.
Right.
But pragmatic in the negative way is like not thinking long range, trying to do what you can, the best you can in the short term. That's usually how I think of it. That whatever works now, say to win an election, it doesn't matter what the consequences might be 10 years down the line. It's just like you're just going for the near term and like playing whack-a-mole in a way. Just you keep going to stay afloat and keep going.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I looked it up. It says without reference to theoretical considerations. I still need to get my head around that because, like, what else would you act on? Like when you judge in the moment.
Statistics, just pure statistics of the moment.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, I think of just not using long-term thinking. If you don't think long-term, then yeah, what would you use? It would just be like some statistical inference or just a rule of thumb that you just kind of like, you don't know if it always applies. It just applies often enough.
But isn't that principles? That's the same as principles. Like you don't know if you can get away. I think the expression was like you can win the battle, but not the war. So sometimes you're going to get away with stealing or whatever. So that's the same thing to me. Like,
yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like long range versus short range. Like if you're thinking long range, then it's fine. Like if you're thinking, how am I going to maintain my life, my existence, my flourishing? Then yeah, I mean, because principles are a little more certain than, oh, it works often enough. It's good enough. Like principles should be more certain. Like within objectivism, they seem to be things that are certain usually.
Okay, more food for thought. I need to go over that. It's an interesting thing.
Just focus on the long-term versus near-term distinction. Like long-term is principled thinking. You could use different
where do you
terms,
draw the
but
line? Do you just mean long term is for the next day, like more than the
long-term being
next
like,
day?
say, the context of your entire life, or
Okay.
most of your, like, yeah, your life.
Okay.
I mean, at least within objectivism, that's the context of long-term thinking, the
Yeah.
context of your entire life, rather than say next year, 5 years or whatever, just the entire span of life.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. That's something I will explore in more detail and come at you with some questions.
Yep.
What do you think of the relationship between motivation and value? Like, does value always imply motivation or no? And does motivation always imply value?
I think motivation should imply value. Like if you're motivated to do something, that is a value. Like you're
Right.
pursuing a value. Like I think having a motivation means you've found a value.
And is motivation the equivalent of desire? Is that what, because we talk about basic emotions, right? We talk about like anger, happiness, anxiety. Like, where does motivation fit in? Is that just a psychological term?
Usually motivation I would understand to be like the feeling of wanting to act and not necessarily the thing you're acting for. Like you're motivated to seek something. And the motivation could be recognizing the consequence or recognizing the pleasure you get from it or recognizing what would be of value if you attained the thing. Like feeling motivated to have.
So you're saying
Desire.
motivation can be attached from the thing. It can just be purely for making an acting.
Yeah, I mean, that's the distinction, but I don't think you can have a motivation without a value. It's just that they're different aspects of the same phenomena. When you're pursuing something, there's a value and there's a motivation. I don't think you could take one away from the other. They're
Yeah.
always there and together.
But it does seem to me like it's equivalent to desire, right? Like if you have it's just capturing desire's got different connotations, but it's describing some like a desire to act, or like some emotional force that makes you want to act in both instances, right?
Yeah, I think that's the right way to look at it because we're taking apart what it means when we say that we're looking at just more than just going towards something, but that it's a sensation, it's a feeling, it's a want.
Bring up fullness, the Memorius. Do you think you could also look into this story as something that represents, like in terms of thinking? I've heard that expression, big picture thinking.
Yeah.
Which you've probably heard. Do you interpret that as thinking in essentials, or what? How do you see big picture thinking? Because I'm thinking about that in the context of this story, of like, I wonder if you could also draw out some kind of connection or implications with big picture thinking, if whatever that is.
Yeah, I think that's what it is. I mean, it's not wrong to not use it sometimes, but big picture thinking is broad, big abstractions.
Okay, and thinking in essentials, because otherwise, if you're thinking in broad,
Yeah.
big abstractions and they're not in essentials, then
Yeah, just be a mess.
yeah. What is what do you know? So obviously, in objectivism, they call it thinking in essentials. But is there a similar language? Is there has that been captured in any other terms from other philosophers? Like,
Not that I know of.
yeah, okay,
Somebody has to. I just don't know. I'd be surprised if no one had a similar phrase or thought.
yeah,
And Aristotle must have some term. But I don't know.
okay. So Iran, what's his name? Iraniel. whatever.
Ireneo, yeah.
Ireneo was incapable of big picture thinking. If he's incapable of abstractions, then he's obviously incapable of big picture thinking.
Yes.
And so to think in terms of the big picture, we could also say that we need to forget a difference. Same principle.
Yeah, I
To
mean,
think is to forget a difference, to generalize, to abstract. To think
yeah.
big picture is to forget a difference.
It's what Rand means when she says like abstracting away a measurement or abstracting something away. It's for a concept to create a concept. I mean, it's still
Cool. Yeah,
the
that's
difference
interesting.
is
Yeah,
the
wow.
difference is just Rand wouldn't say you're forgetting. It's there.
Yeah.
You're just not. It's not part of your the mental content you're accessing. You can break it down later if you want, but it's not literally forgotten. But it's like put aside is more like the better phrase for it.
Okay. But it's put aside and it probably does fade in your memory. And then you can just, I think you told me about the theory of memory recreation, where you just recreate it based on, I don't know, you've got other bits in your mind, like, things can have color, or, they can have, you have some images of what color looks like, and you just substitute that in.
Yeah, things like that. Does that make sense?
What about context in this story? Like the concept of context. Can you make any connections between Ireneo and...
Well, each moment is a context. Like each moment is a distinct context, and there's no general context. It's just each moment is like a picture, like new context, new context, new context.
Right, unrelated to the next.
Yeah. It doesn't have a wide context, like context being like just, oh, Argentina. Like, it's just no, there's snapshot, snapshot, snapshot.
Right. Okay. All right, cool. That's, I mean, I got more questions, but I don't want to launch into them because we will